Introduction 1. The book and its author. Today, Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass is almost universally recognized as one of the masterpieces of world literature, but it didn't have an impressive beginning. Early in July 1855, a thin quarto volume of 95 pages bound in green cloth ornately stamped with roots, leaves, buds, and small flowers was placed on sale in several stores in New York and Brooklyn. Although it was distributed and advertised by Fowler and Wells, publishers of books and magazines on phrenology, Leaves of Grass had been printed at the author's own expense by his friends the Rome brothers in Brooklyn. Fewer than 800 copies were printed, and of these only 200 were immediately bound. Whitman held his name from the title page, but displayed himself in shirt sleeves in a nonchalant pose in a frontispiece photograph. Doubtless, he intended this to emphasize the personal nature of his poems and their informal style, a guess corroborated by a passage in his longest poem, then untitled but later called Song of Myself, in which he stated his name and his supposed attributes. Walt Whitman, a cosmos of Manhattan the sun, turbulent, fleshy, sensual, eating, drinking, and breeding, no sentimentalist, no standard above men and women or apart from them, no more modest than immodest. But this eccentric manner of signing his book made Ralph Waldo Emerson, to whom Whitman sent a complimentary copy, doubtful of the real name of the poet. On July 1855, he wrote, "I did not know until I last night saw the book advertised in the newspaper that I could trust the name as real and available for our post office." Emerson was one of the few literary men to see merit in this strange book, indeed one of the few persons to read it at all, though there were more than the poet knew about at the time. In his first unrestrained enthusiasm, the older poet wrote the younger, "I greet you at the beginning of a great career, which yet must have had a long foreground somewhere for such a start. I rub my eyes a little to see if this sunbeam were no illusion, but the solid sense of the book is a sober certainty." Whitman was naturally delighted. Well, he might have been, with such warm praise from the famous New England poet. It fortified him against the abuse of less perceptive critics, and he was soon to receive enough abuse to overwhelm a sensitive young poet. But Walt Whitman was abundantly endowed with courage and determination. He immediately began preparation of a second edition to be published the following year. There were a few other readers who recognized the importance of the first Leaves of Grass, but Emerson alone sensed its long foreground. Indeed, it has taken critics and scholars nearly a century to discover the truth of Emerson's sure insight. Not even Whitman's intimate friends and associates, in fact they least of all, were aware of the vast intellectual preparation effort that went into the 1855 Leaves of Grass. His formal education had been scanty, being limited to 5 or 6 years of attending public school in the village of Brooklyn, New York. He was born May 31st, 1819 at West Hills, a little farming community on Long Island 3 miles south of Huntington. His father had learned the carpenter's trade and is said to have been a competent and meticulous workman, but for some reason he never prospered. He was in fact already a failure when he moved his family to Brooklyn in 1823. He was interested in books and ideas, especially those of the deistic Tom Paine, whom he knew personally, and the socialistic theories of Francis Wright. But he had received almost no formal education. His wife, Louisa Van Velser, daughter of a Dutch farmer on Long Island, was nearly illiterate. Walter Whitman, Jr. was the second of 9 children. Because his father was always hard-pressed to feed and clothe his large family, he began at the age of 11 to work as an office boy. By his 12th year, he had quit school altogether and was apprenticed to the printing trade. For 2 decades, he worked alternately as printer and journalist, except for 2 years of teaching in various country schools in Long Island. During the 1840s, he wrote for popular magazines, edited several newspapers in New York City, and held the editorship of the Brooklyn Eagle for 2 years. The stories and poems he contributed to the magazines were conventional, sentimental, and undistinguished, but in journalism he was fairly competent. However, he did not prosper as an editor because practically all newspapers at that time were violently partisan, and his free soil convictions did not agree with the political policies of the Democratic owners of the papers on which he was employed. After he lost his editorship of the Brooklyn Eagle, Whitman traveled by train, stagecoach, and steamboat to New Orleans, then an arduous journey where he worked for 3 months in a newly founded Crescent. Returning to Brooklyn, he edited a Free Soil newspaper and took an active part in the campaign of Martin Van Buren and Charles Francis Adams on the Free Soil ticket in 1848. Whitman continued to edit his paper, The Freeman, for nearly a year after the defeat of the Free Soil Party, but he was finally forced to give up. Though nominally a Democrat, Whitman now found the Democratic press virtually closed to him. His political convictions forced him out of journalism, though he continued to contribute occasionally to the New York Post, edited by his friend William Cullen Bryant, the Tribune, edited by Horace Greeley, and the Brooklyn Advertiser. But he could not support himself with these fugitive pieces. It was not by accident, or caprice therefore, that he joined his father in the building trade. In a short time he became a contractor, speculating modestly in real estate and house building like his father, though with more success. In fact, the early 1850s, Brooklyn was experiencing a lively building boom, and Whitman had excellent opportunities for accumulating wealth. He might have done so too if he had not acquired a greater ambition. This ambition was the writing and publishing of a volume of poems which at an early stage in his planning he had decided to call Leaves of Grass. For years, orators, authors, and editorial writers had been calling for a native literature commensurate with American natural resources, ample geography, and political idealism. This demand for an indigenous literature had of course been profoundly influenced by European Romanticism, and yet at the same time national pride had brought about the intellectual rejection of Europe politically and culturally. In 1837, Emerson declared in his American Scholar Address, "Our day of dependence, our long apprenticeship to the learning of other lands draws to a close. We have listened too long to the courtly muses of Europe." The call for an original native poet stirred Walt Whitman's imagination. He himself was descended from several generations of typical rural Americans, half Dutch, half British in origin. For his daily associates, he habitually chose the mechanics, ferryboat pilots, state drivers, and rough and educated working men whom he had known all his life as relatives, neighbors, and companions in the saloons and on the streets of Brooklyn and New York. He shared their patriotic pride in the territorial expansion of the young nation and looked upon the material growth of the United States as a blessing to all mankind, providing a refuge for the oppressed of every nation. He was acutely aware of his country's shortcomings and hoped through his poems and speeches for many years he cherished a futile ambition of becoming a great public speaker, to spread and propagate democracy. But if Walt Whitman's qualifications for becoming his nation's poetic spokesman had been no more than devout patriotism and a journalist's gift for propaganda, he wouldn't have become a great poet. Ever. To an educated observer, Whitman would have seemed to have almost no chance at all of becoming a real poet, but appearances were deceiving. In his own way, he had been acquiring exactly the training he needed. Despite his slow movements and leisurely habits, his careless dress and association with ferrymen and stage drivers, he had assiduously cultivated his mind and aesthetic sensibilities. From early boyhood he had been fond of the theater, and as a young man he became a devotee of the Italian opera. In Brooklyn he had also become intimate with partners and sculptors, notably William Sidney Mount, Walter Libby, Henry Kirk Brown, and John Quincy Ward. He spent many hours in the libraries of New York City, and in the 1850s he frequented the Egyptian Museum on Lower Broadway, where he acquired an interest in the history of the human race and the myths and religions of ancient peoples that broadened his intellectual horizon. In both cities, he attended lectures on astronomy, which also gave him new concepts of time and man's place in the vast structure of the universe. Although largely self-taught, Walt Whitman actually read more widely both in quantity and in variety of subjects than many of the authors of the period who had attended famous colleges. Whenever possible, however, he obtained knowledge through talks with explorers, scientists, and learned persons, such as Dr. Henry Abbott, owner of the Egyptian Museum. Walt Whitman was indeed a paradox. He recited Shakespeare from the top of a Broadway omnibus, where he sat beside the driver. He carried translations of Homer in his pocket when he went on fishing trips or spent the day alone on Coney Island in a lonely spot. By choice he consorted with the most ignorant men, but loved opera and was welcomed in the studios of leading painters and sculptors. But neither experience with the world nor the reading of many books makes a poet. He must, first of all, be endowed with a poet's temperament and sensibility, and ultimately with the gift of language. This endowment defies objective analysis, but Whitman's poems testify to the acute sensitivity of his touching insight and spout. Most important of all in the making of a great poet is the inner compulsion demanding outlet through the symbols of poetry. Whitman experienced this compulsion to an extraordinary degree in the years immediately preceding the completion of the first edition of Leaves of Grass. To one of his most intimate friends, he confessed later that he had written the first leaves under great pressure from within. He felt that he must do it. This confession indicates a strong probability that the real motivating force was subconscious, as the abundance of sexual imagery in the early poems implies. Whitman rationalized his motive by contending in an open letter to Emerson, printed in the second edition of Leaves of Grass, that sex must be brought out of concealment into the open in order to foster a sane, healthy attitude towards this important phase of life. In the 20th century, this argument is readily acceptable, and one of Whitman's most lasting achievements was his contribution toward the breaking down of prudery and taboos against sex in literature. But probably Whitman himself was only dimly aware of the generating power of the pressure from within. In his early poems, he exhibited a strong desire to make personal confessions. In Song of Myself, section 28, he feels betrayed by his senses and complains of the prurient provokers stiffening my limbs. This motivation has been explained by several critics as autoeroticism, but the term is hardly adequate for the poet's complex psychology. There can no longer be any doubt that, despite their intensity, Whitman's sexual impulses were somewhat ambiguous. Every human organism, biologists tell us, is some cells of the opposite sex. In the absence of scientific data, we can only guess the balance of the sexes in the body of Walt Whitman, but his compulsion to confess and to justify his emotions indicates at least a strong psychic disturbance. Later, Whitman used the word perturbation for this disturbance, a term which he had encountered on the lectures on astronomy which he had heard and read. The term means disturbance of the regular motion of a heavenly body produced by some force additional to that which causes its regular motion. Whitman himself thought his drum taps poems superior aesthetically to Leaves of Grass because they had none of the perturbations of Leaves of Grass, the first three editions. The process by which a poem is created in the mind of a poet is still little understood by psychologists or literary critics, but it seems to begin with a profound emotional turbulence, probably on the subconscious level. From this turbulence, not only emotional impulses, but even verbal images float up to the poet's unconsciousness. If he writes the poem while the turbulence is still going on, he is not likely to have control over his aesthetic form. This theory illuminates the problem of aesthetics in Whitman's poems. It is most vivid and original imagery is found in Song of Myself, but the emotional tone of the poem is very uneven, and the structure has defied the best efforts of many critics, though some recent ones profess to find a thematic structure in it. Furthermore, there is frequently a conflict between Whitman's desire to be personal, to make intimate revelations to the reader, and his intuitions of truth about life and the meaning of existence. In writing Crossing Brook and Ferry, Whitman had sufficient control over his inner turbulence to compose a poem with beautiful symmetry and imagery, rhythm, and pattern of symbols. A few years later, in Out of the Cradle, Endlessly Rocking, he exhibited similar control, and the same can be said of When Lilacs Last and the Dooryard Bloomed, which was completed several months after the death of President Lincoln, an exemplification of Wordsworth's theory of emotion recollected in tranquility. It is significant, too, that in these poems which the poet has controls, poetic messages transcending the time and achieving a philosophy of death. In the Crossing Brooklyn Ferry poem, life is always fluid and souls are forever crossing from the material to the immaterial world and back again. In the Cradle poem, the boy becomes a poet when he vicariously gains knowledge of death. In When Lilacs Last and the Dooryard Bloomed, the poet joins hands with the thought of death, grief for a personal loss, and the knowledge of death, philosophical acceptance, comrades mine and I in the midst, and arrives with them completely resigned at the end of the coffin's journey in the fragrant pines and cedars, dusk and dim. Here the poet submerges his own personality and thereby transcends the bounds of his finite life. He achieves the fullness of selfhood, always his poetic and philosophical goal, and his aesthetic intuition of the necessity for physical dissolution and the perpetuity of life. Of course, Whitman's personal experiences that created the turbulence in Whitman's psyche profoundly affected his poetic intuitions, but the relationship between biography and artistic creation is so complex and subtle that it cannot be satisfactorily explained, if ever, in a few sentences, though some hints can be given. Whitman's reading of Lucretius may account for his intellectual acceptance in his first two editions of death as part of the cycle of nature. At first he was anxious about his personal identity, but he was consoled, as Song of the Opera Road shows, by believing the progress of the souls of the men and women along the grand roads of the universe. In this period, his poetic faculties were exhilaratingly stimulated by his psychic turmoils. They did not affect him in an unhealthy manner. But the failures of Whitman's first two editions, lack of success in his editorship in the Brooklyn Times in 1857-59, and his inability to find rewarding love and friendship brought him to almost tragic despair around 1859. Early in 1860, he was elated by the offer of a young British publishing house there in Eldridge to bring out a new, expanded edition of Leaves of Grass. A few months later, however, the firm went into bankruptcy as the result of the Civil War. Though discouraged by bankruptcy, the poet was beneficially stimulated by the war. Beat! Beat! Drums! Witnesses his surging patriotism. He did not enlist because he was 42 and the main support of his mother and a feeble-minded brother, Edward, but a year and a half later he went down to the battlefield in Virginia to find his wounded brother George, whose wound proved not to be serious, and stayed on Washington to help alleviate suffering in the army hospitals. The wound dresser shows the compassion that the hospital scenes aroused in him. Now that he had seen death itself, he merely thought and dreamed of it. After the war, Whitman remained in Washington as a government clerk until a paralytic stroke in 1873 forced him to depart. He then went to live with George in Camden, New Jersey. His mother also died that year during the winter of 1873 to 74. Whitman was so lonely and depressed that he longed for death, but Prayer of Columbus reveals the religious faith that saved him. Although he never recovered his health, the last 2 decades in Camden were relieved by increasing recognition abroad, especially in England, and he was able to draw spiritual strength and emotional solace from the philosophy which he had spent a lifetime cultivating. He died March 26, 1892, racked by a half-dozen diseases, but calm and cheerful to the last. He had become the great poet he had envisioned in 1855.